presentation for college prep world history. And today's topic is going to be on the Protestant Reformation. And it's one of those really big major events in world history which we don't spend a lot of time talking about in the college prep class. However, it does have a significant impact on modern world history due to the effects that it has on the power of the Catholic Church. And so it's really important that we cover this particular topic because Martin Luther probably didn't really intend to start a Reformation to the extent that it went to. You probably have maybe either knowingly or unknowingly have been experiencing part of that Reformation today, whether it be through a Christian church that you attend, or it could be a Protestant church, it could be a Baptist church, it could be a Puritan church, so on and so forth. Those are all the effects or product of the Protestant Reformation. Now, what I mean by unintended Reformation is that Martin Luther, who was a Catholic, just really intended to bring to light the problems that he felt the church was putting on their own people. And he wanted to make that public so they would make changes, not necessarily leave the church, but just make changes to the church for the betterment of the church. And so this is why I coined it the unintended Reformation, because there really probably wasn't any, initially, there wasn't really any desire by Martin Luther to try to change religions or to start the Protestant faith or Lutheranism, which is his particular sect of Protestantism. It was more of an awakening or bringing to light the problems that were in existence in the Catholic Church. And so we're going to kind of touch upon those today. We want to make sure that we bring all the causes as well as the effects of the Protestant Reformation to light. There are many that we will be covering. And so before we get into the first major slide here, we probably want to talk about what's happening prior to this. Why is religion being challenged? The Catholic Church up until this point is probably one of the most powerful entities on the planet. And what I mean by that is it has probably influence on almost all, if not all, of the monarchies that exist all throughout Europe. And so it's really important that the Catholic Church have a positive relationship with a majority of the different European kings throughout all of Europe. And so because of the Reformation, we really see almost what we would call a figurative black eye being placed on the Catholic Church. And from that point forward, we see the Catholic Church lose a lot of its influence and power over this, what we call globalization of Europe, or the globalization of the world, where we're seeing now the Catholic Church has to reach out to other parts of the world in order to gain followers. And so we're going to go ahead and dive into the Reformation. Again, prior to this, we've had the Black Plague. The Black Plague existed, and people questioned the church and God. Why would God do this to 30 to 60% of the European population? Why would 30 to 60% of the population die because of this disease? And this kind of relates to probably some things we're going on presently with, distance learning and the pandemic that's currently going on. Maybe not to the same extent, because we've seen as throughout history that it's not on the same level. We're not seeing a 30 to 60% death rate due to COVID-19, but still, nonetheless, not to get too political, there's still a connection between the Black Death and basically a pandemic or an epidemic and a pandemic. Something that we're seeing has a direct effect on families, a direct effect on our education, and we can kind of trace that back to earlier bouts of history. And so we're going to go ahead and dive into the Reformation. We got also the Renaissance occurring as well. So we're seeing this this awakening of individualism and humanism, the idea that people are now going to be expressing themselves through art and literature. And so we're seeing all these different events having a direct effect on religion. And so let's go ahead and move on to this first slide that we have. And this first slide, what we're going to go ahead and see with the first slide is we're going to see what was the Reformation. So again, Martin Luther being an integral member of the Reformation, somebody who played an important role. Now, he wasn't the only one who was involved in the Reformation. Obviously, there's many other people that were involved with the Reformation, but Martin Luther really is the one that we credit with starting or bringing to light the problems that existed within the church. Now, first and foremost, one of the biggest things that existed in the church itself was the idea of the indulgence, and we're going to see that on this first slide. An indulgence basically is a penance, a way of performing penance for your sins. Now, in the Catholic Church, it's very common if you are going to go ahead and confess your sins to a priest. The priest will probably give you some sort of penance that you have to do in order to make up for your sin. Usually it's prayer. You say, the Hail Mary or Our Father in order to really seek a connection with God and ask for forgiveness from God for the sins that you've committed. Now that would normally occur, but as we see throughout the time of Martin Luther, there's a line of different corrupt popes. We see Leo X, who's considered the Renaissance Pope, and these different Renaissance popes really gave way to the idea of the indulgence. The indulgence is the idea that a parishioner or a believer in God can just pay some money to the priest, to a bishop, to the Pope even, in order to be granted forgiveness of their sins. And so that was really a divergence away from the original intention of penance for your sins. We're now seeing that the church in many of the different kingdoms throughout Europe, France and Spain, are really financially benefiting from the indulgence. And in most cases, especially like in a place like France, who's really heavily Catholic, we're seeing the church becoming really rich. They're becoming part of this, what we call first estate, where they're some of the richest people within the kingdom, and they're able to purchase lands and garner wealth. So this is really important that Martin Luther brings this to light. This is not what the Catholic Church, in his eyes, should be doing in order to improve itself. And so he's really fed up with the different methods by the priests and the bishops and the Pope in order to gain financial wealth. And so what does Martin Luther do? Martin Luther takes this list, what he calls these 95 theses, this list of problems that he really, really doesn't like about the church. He puts them on the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, and he really brings attention to these problems to a greater percentage of the population. Now, there's other things that are going on during this time as well, like the printing press is really becoming prevalent through Europe, and this different mixture of things that are occurring throughout this time really paves the way for Martin Luther to be able to get his message out to all of the disgruntled Catholics. So Johannes Gutenberg creates the printing press and the movable type, and Johannes Gutenberg is able to print the Gutenberg Bible, which can be read in German by the German people, because in most cases the church performed the services in Latin, and most people didn't read Latin. They didn't understand Latin. It usually was only the priests and the clergy who understood Latin. And so therefore, now that they're able to read the Bible in German and understand these different passages from the Bible in German, they're beginning to interpret them differently than maybe what the priest is telling them. And so we're seeing this differentiation of the the idea of what's being written down on paper, which again is probably something that we see today in our nation. We see something, we read it, and we interpret it differently than maybe the person next to us. And so, what really is the truth behind the words that were written? And the great thing about history and studying history is that it's in the eye of the beholder. It's up to you to decide what is true and what isn't true and how it's interpreted. And again, this is one of those instances. Luther's idea of having the Bible printed in German, where the German people are now interpreting these things for themselves. All right, and so now as we begin to see all these different problems existing, we're beginning to see that people are now urging the church to reform. The church needs to change itself if it wants to keep these people within the flock. And so it's either the decision needs to be made by the clergy. Are we going to make changes, or are these things going to continue to be the norm? Are they going to continue to be allowed within the Catholic Church? And so we have this conflict between the parishioners and the clergy, and really the question is, who's going to win? Is it going to be the clergy, or is it going to be the parishioners? And so we're going to kind of cover that here in the next slide as well. A little bit more, we have to be able to differentiate between what the beliefs of the Catholic Church are and what the beliefs are of the new different Protestant churches that are beginning to emerge. What are the big differences between the two? So, a lot of the sticking points I kind of mentioned already. Indulgences was one. There's some others in there. For example, a big difference between the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches today would be clergy, the marriage of clergy. A priest in the Catholic Church today cannot marry, and if you're in a Protestant church, you are allowed to marry and have a family. That would be one big difference we would see. Another one would be women. Women are allowed to practice as bishops and clergy women in Protestant churches, and today the only real role in the Catholic Church that women have are that of nuns. So there's a big difference and like a widening divide between the Protestant and Catholic faiths after the Protestant Reformation really takes hold and followers begin to leave the Catholic Church and move into these different Protestant groups. And we'll talk about the different Protestant groups here in the slide coming up. But one of the biggest differences that we see between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church is the Bible. The Catholic Church wants the Catholic parishioners to believe that the Pope or the papacy is the utmost authority in all things with God, whereas the Protestant faith uses the Bible as the utmost authority for all things Christian. And this is a big difference because remember, the Bible can be interpreted different ways. And when the Pope is telling you something, there's only one way that it can be interpreted, and it's the way of the Pope. So that is a big difference between the Catholic and the Protestant faiths. Also, Luther is encouraging lay people to read the Bible for themselves, and I mentioned that before. The Bible being printed in German was a huge deal because now normal, ordinary people who were illiterate, who would only understand maybe basic understandings of German in Germany, could now read the Bible for themselves. And from that point on, we're going to see as the centuries pass further and further along, we're going to see that the Bible is printed in other languages as well, not just German, but in French and Italian and so on and so forth. And Latin's going to become a less important language. If we were talking about Latin today, it would be called a dead language because it's not really taught anymore in school. So it's really a dead language, and we use all these different Romantic languages now. Students can study Spanish, Italian, French, and we're seeing all these other different languages now being taught. And then a big one would be salvation. And again, forgiveness of the sins in the church for Protestants would be from God himself, whereas the papacy would be able to give you penance for your sins in the Catholic Church. And so these are some really big differences in the different faiths, the different, especially in the Protestant faith. This is a big sticking point, and we're going to see for over 100 years there's going to be wars within France that are conducted because of religion, and really nothing is going to be solved until we see the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648, where we see this conclusion being reached that, hey, the Protestant faith is not going away. And so the Catholic Church really acknowledges at that point that Protestantism is an official world religion. And so that's really where we begin to see Protestantism really take off and become a competing religion for the Catholic faith. There are two primary groups that are born out of the Protestant movement. Now, there are many others, like Lutheranism, that come about very quickly, but there's two that we're going to talk about primarily here because of the different beliefs that they have that maybe are not what we normally talked about with Protestantism, but yet they're really important because there are pretty important religious groups that still exist today. So the first one is Calvinism. And again, Calvinism is primarily an Eastern French Protestant faith. And remember, France is primarily Catholic. So it's really important that we cover Calvinism, mainly because of the idea of predestination. And John Calvin was someone who taught the idea that your life, as it is determined for you already. So some would say, well, that's great, but can I change it? Can I change my life to whatever I want it to be? And, normally that would be something that we would think of, and it's totally possible. But John Calvin would say that, well, if you try to change your life, that's what you were destined to do anyway. So the idea of predestination is your life, the way it goes, is already determined. So no matter what you do, you're already determined to live your life a certain way. That is the primary idea, that God has already determined what your life will be. And no matter how you try to change it, that was what your destiny was to be. So a little bit of a different thing. Maybe not something we primarily think of here in the United States, the idea of Calvinism, but predestination does exist. The other part is the Dutch or Polish Anabaptists, who are believers in adult baptism. And again, the motivation for adult baptism is the idea that if you're an adult, you have the ability to make up your own mind if this is what you want to do. So adult baptism is important because in the Catholic faith, a lot of Catholic believers are baptized as infants. Your mother and father pick godparents for you, and you were baptized as an infant, probably don't remember it. And so one of your sacraments, your first sacrament as a Catholic, is the idea of baptism. And Anabaptists believe that you should be an adult and be able to make up your own mind whether or not you want to be baptized into the Anabaptist faith. And again, today, more of a modern example of Anabaptist faith is here in the United States. We have communities of Amish people. And again, we probably look at those people and think to ourselves, well, they're so far behind what a modern society is. But again, that is the idea that separates them from other faiths, is this isolation, this community isolation, where they live in a non-technological world, and they are firm believers in that is what is right and what is a part of their community. And so that would be a modern day example of what an Anabaptist community would look like. And finally, our last slide here is to cover the Catholic Reformation, or the counter-Reformation to the actual Protestant Reformation and break away from the Catholic Church. So in response to the formation of the Protestant faiths, the Catholic Church was seeing a large amount of followers begin to break away from the church. So they wanted to do something to prevent this from happening or to slow the exodus from the Catholic Church. So they launched what they called the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. And the leader of the Counter-Reformation was Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola was the leader of a group called the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. Now, this group, you would think, in order to get followers to come back, would compromise in some way in order to lure them back into the Catholic faith. However, they actually did the opposite. They went back to a much more strict form of Catholic faith and reinforced the idea that people need to be obedient to the papacy and follow the will of God. And so therefore, the Catholic Church, rather than luring them back in, ended up just basically trying to prevent more people from leaving. And so there were some really strict lines formed between the Protestants and the Catholics, especially after the Counter-Reformation, because they really didn't do anything to repair their reputation after the Protestant Reformation started to take many of these parishioners away from the Catholic faith. And so the big focus for the Society of Jesus and St. Ignatius of Loyola was to educate young people at a very early age about Catholicism in order for them to follow those tenets of Catholicism. And then also the Catholics and the Society of Jesus really focused on trying to find new followers in different places. So for example, going to South America, the Spaniards claiming the places of the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, and turning those indigenous populations into Catholics. And so what you see basically from this point on is many times when the Europeans arrive, especially Catholic Europeans and Christian Europeans as a whole, when they arrive into new parts of the world and interact with these different peoples, you're really going to see that the first contact that is made between many of these groups is with missionaries. And missionaries, again, are people whose sole purpose is to try to convert these indigenous people to their religious beliefs. And usually it's Catholicism and Christianity that leads the way with this. Islam also does this in other parts of the world. For example, Islam does this in India and converts many of the indigenous Indian people of South Asia into Muslims. And so we see we'll be covering that much later on in the second semester, where Muslims and Hindus interact with one another, and sometimes in a violent way. But what we see is Catholicism really begin to spread outside of the confines of Europe because of the Protestant Reformation and in a way the Counter-Reformation. So an effect of the Protestant Reformation would be the spreading of the Catholic faith worldwide. And that's really a big focus of the what we would see as like a central theme of modern world history, which is what we call globalization, and really spreading ideas from one place to another and all over the world. And we're going to see this common theme happen many times throughout our study of modern world history. So this concludes our presentation on the Protestant Reformation. And again, if you have questions, I'm here for you. Mr. Willis is here for you. Mr. Gordon, Ms. Pancini, Mrs. Atwood, we're all here for you. So please feel free to reach out either through Remind or an email, and we'll be happy to help you guys out. Take care.